Good morning and welcome to Bellevue Christian Cyber Church. We're going to worship God this morning. Why don't you stand with us? Send a text to a friend from church. Tell them you miss them. Tell them that you hope they're staying healthy and they're washing their hands, and invite them to worship with us this morning too.
was mercy in your eyes to fulfill the law and prophets. To a virgin came the word from a throne of endless glory to a cradle in the dirt. Praise the Father, praise the Son, praise the Spirit, three in one. God of glory, majesty, oh, praise forever to the King of Kings. To reveal the kingdom coming and to reconcile the lost, to redeem the whole creation. You did not despise the cross, for even in your suffering you saw to the other side, knowing this was our salvation. Jesus, for our sake you died. And praise the Father, praise the Son, praise the Spirit, three in one. God of glory, majesty, oh, praise forever to the King of Kings. In the morning that you rose, all of heaven held its breath, till that stone was moved for good, for the Lamb had conquered death. And the dead rose from their tombs, and the angels stood in awe, for the souls of all who'd come to the Father are restored. And the church of Christ was born, then the Spirit lit the flame. Now this gospel truth of old shall not kneel, shall not fade. By his blood and in his name, in his freedom I am free. For the love
child of God. And I am surrounded and by the arms of the Father, and I am surrounded by songs of deliverance. We've been liberated and from our bondage. We're the sons and the daughters. Let us sing our freedom. Oh, you split the sea so I could walk right through it. My fears were drowned in perfect love. You rescued me so I could stand and sing. I am a child of God. You split the sea so I could walk right through it. My fears were drowned in perfect love. You rescued me so I could stand and sing. I am a child of God. I am a child of God. I am a child of God. I'm no longer a slave to fear, 'cause I am a child of God. I'm no longer a slave to fear, because I am a child of God. Worthy of every song we could ever sing, worthy of all the praise we could ever bring, worthy of every breath we could ever breathe. We live for you. Jesus, the name above every other name. Jesus, the only one who could ever save. Worthy of every breath we could ever breathe. We live for you. Oh, we live for you. And holy, there is no one like you. There is none beside you. Open up my eyes in trust in you alone, and I will not be shaken. Lord, we give you praise, we give you honor, we give you glory. We build our life on you. We press in the faith, not fear. We're built on the solid rock, not the sand. For we will stand on your mercies and your grace, God, even in trial. We have victory. We thank you for the blood of the cross, for redeeming our sins. It's in your name that we pray, Lord. Amen.
Hey church family, I'm Austin Goen, the lead pastor at Bellevue Christian Church, if you don't know me. And I want to give you a quick word of encouragement from the book of Jeremiah, chapter 29. In that book of Jeremiah, the people have been exiled and displaced, and there's a letter written to God's people who have just been exiled, and they're feeling uncertain, they're feeling displaced, they're feeling unsettled. And he says two things to them that I think are helpful for us even now in our own kind of feelings of displacement. And the first thing he says is, this is going to be a while, so settle in. He says to them, don't just wait around for things to get back to normal, but rather establish your rhythms and make the most of life right now. He says, plant gardens, build houses, get married, have babies, all of these things that are the natural rhythms of life. He says, don't wait till you get back to life as normal to start those. Establish your rhythms in the midst of uncertainty, in the midst of all that's going on. This is going to be a while, he says, so settle in. But he doesn't end there. He says this. He says, this won't last forever, so have hope. He quotes the Lord saying this. It's a famous verse. It says, for I know the plans I have for you, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you a hope and a future. It's Jeremiah chapter 29, verse 11. And so not only is this going to be a while so we can settle in, we also know this isn't going to last forever, so we can have hope. And we can know that God will see us through, that he has a good purpose for us. And this is what I call hopeful realism. It's both realizing that this might take a while, but it's also realizing that there will one day be an end to it. And I think it's what we need most right now. And so when it comes to settling in, one of the things that we've done as a church is we've actually updated our whole website so that it's simpler and easier to navigate right now in a church where we're gathering, or in a season where our church is gathering online. So if you get a chance, go check out our website, bellevuechristian.church. And if you're joining our church for the first time, maybe because a friend from our church invited you and you found out about our sermons online, we don't want to miss you, so take a minute and go to our website. There's a little place that says, I'm new here. Click that, fill out a little form so that we can get in contact with you this week and let you know and welcome you into the life of our church. As a reminder, we also created an at-home worship guide for you to follow along with the service. You can use a PDF online. It's on the front page of the website, or you can download it and just follow along with the PDF. There's song lyrics, there's instructions for communion, and there's some stuff on prayer, and then also commissioning as well that you can use at home. Also, I know that some of you are struggling financially right now and aren't able to give to our church like you did a few weeks ago, and that's okay. I want to let you know that we feel with you and that we want to actually provide for you at this time. But if you are able to give, we need it now more than ever as a church, and there's two ways that you can do that, online and also by sending us a check. Online, you can go to bellevuechristian.church/give. Some of you contacted me last week telling me that you gave online for the first time ever, and you said that it was really easy, and you were surprised that you hadn't been doing it earlier. And so if you've never given online, give it a try this week. It's one of the easiest ways to give to our church. Or you can send a check, I know some of you did that, to 680 Lincoln Avenue, Bellevue, PA 15202. I want to give a quick shout out to our DC leaders, discipleship community leaders. We had a Zoom call with them this last week, and just like our church, they found a way to pivot their discipleship communities, and so many of them met online this week for the first time to try to adjust to current conditions. Did a great job. I'm not the leader of my own, but Emily Podlesnik is, and she helped organize a way for us to meet online. And so just really proud of our discipleship community leaders. And as a note on that, we also have discussion guides that we build for discipleship communities to use each week to go deeper into the sermon. And if you can use that on your own in a journal or just in your own quiet time, or you can use it even with your family as well. Another thing we created last week that we barely got to mention was we wanted to make it as easy as possible for you to love and bless your neighbors right now. And so we've created what we're calling Hello Neighbor cards. We got this idea from a couple other churches that you can fill out and drop in your neighbors' mailboxes, obviously from a safe social distance. And the cards have space for you to write your name, your email, your phone number, and then let them know some ways that you could help them right now, especially if you're a low-risk person and able to go get groceries or medicine for someone. And then finally, we want to make sure that you feel cared for and prayed for during a season that's difficult for many of us. And so there's a couple things I want you to know about. First of all, if you need care, you can reach out and email care@bellevuechristian.church, and someone from our care team will get back to you with how we can help. And if you're low risk and willing to help, you can also let us know that you're able to help. But right now, we have more people who are able to help than people who need help in our church at the moment. If you need prayer, you can email prayer@bellevuechristian.church, and someone from our prayer team will reach out to you and pray with you this week if you want. They'll actually give you a phone call and let you know that they can pray with you on the phone, or you can just let us know that you'd like your request to be prayed for and nobody will call you. It just depends whatever you want. And so you can find forms for prayer and care online at our website, bellevuechristian.church, or you can send an email to care@bellevuechristian.church or prayer@bellevuechristian.church. As I mentioned last week, we're gonna keep going through our series on Esther. We're gonna start something new on Easter in 2 weeks, but right now we're gonna be finishing out the book of Esther over these next 2 weeks. And so we're in the second to last episode of The Sovereign. It's an 8-week series where we've been trying to imagine what it would be like to read into the book of Esther as if it were a binge-worthy Netflix show. And if last week was the episode I was looking most forward to, this week is the episode that I was dreading the most. In fact, I even thought about taking this opportunity to skip it and to even end our series last week rather than cover this episode. So let me give you a quick summary of episodes 1 through 6, which is basically Esther 1 through 8. We covered in 6 episodes. But we're in ancient Persia. It's the 5th century BC. King Xerxes is ruling over the Persian Empire. He gets rid of his wife Vashti after she displeases him. And then we meet Esther, who's a Jewish orphan, who's living in exile from her homeland, and she ends up winning a horrific contest to be the next wife and queen of Queen Xerxes. And at the same time, Haman arises to power. He's kind of a Jafar-like villain who's promoted to prime minister, and he decides he wants to kill all the Jews in the empire after Mordecai, who's Esther's Jewish cousin, offends him and won't bow to him. And then in a turn of events, Esther claims her Jewish identity. She begs the king to do something about this decree that's out there to kill all the Jews. Haman, who put that decree out there, is impaled above the city, but the decree to kill the Jews is still in effect. And so last week, as we read, Haman is replaced with Mordecai. So Mordecai is now in power. And together, Mordecai and Esther draft a new decree that essentially legalizes a war between the Jews and those who want to kill them, since they can't actually get rid of the original decree. And that's going to go into effect on the 12th month of the year, 9 months later. As a reminder, we've been casting characters throughout the series. King Xerxes is being played by Tony Shalhoub. Queen Vashti is played by Golshifta Farahani. She's gone out of the series now. Queen Esther is Gal Gadot. Haman is Jafar, or Marwan Kenzari, who plays the live-action Jafar. He's now dead. And Mordecai is played by Jeff Goldblum. And this week, we're in episode 7. And we're seeing the gruesome details of what unfolds in the Persian Empire as a result of Mordecai and Esther's new decree. And it opens up one of the most common critiques I've heard of the Bible and Christianity. And so we're going to try to explore that and unpack that a little bit today. So if you have your Bibles this morning, open up to Esther chapter 9, verses 1 through 19. This is episode 7, which we're calling The War. So Esther chapter 9, verse 1 through 19, this is episode 7, The War. If this chapter really was an episode in a binge-worthy Netflix series, this would be the episode with the huge choreographed battle scene. It'd be like the Battle of Minas Tirith in The Return of the King. It would be like the final battle scenes in Braveheart or The Patriot. I'm not sure why I'm thinking only of Mel Gibson movies, but it would be essentially like the biggest battle scene you can imagine in a TV show or a movie, the one that's kind of the climactic moment of the show. And so we're going to read and unpack this scene, starting with Esther chapter 9, verse 1. It says this: "On the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar, the edict commanded by the king was to be carried out. On this day, the enemies of the Jews had hoped to overpower them, But now the tables were turned, and the Jews got the upper hand over those who hated them. And so at this point, we've skipped ahead 9 months in the story. Between the end of chapter 8 and the beginning of chapter 9, 9 months have passed from the 3rd month of the year to the 12th month of the year. And we're now going all the way up to the day when 2 decrees go into effect throughout the 127 provinces of the Persian Empire. Essentially, again, legalizing a war between the Jews and everyone else. Remember, there was Decree 1, which was written by Haman, which went into effect was written in the 1st month, and it permitted anyone who wanted to destroy, kill, or annihilate all the Jews and to take their homes, belongings, and wealth on the 13th day of the 12th month of the year. Then, later, 2 months later, there was another decree written by Esther and Mordecai, which gave the Jews now permission to destroy, kill, and annihilate anyone who attacked them and to take all their homes, belonging, and wealth on the 13th day of the 12th month. And so now 9 months have passed. We're now on the 13th day of the 12th month. Both decrees are going into effect, allowing these 2 groups to kill and destroy one another. And now let's read on to chapter 9, verse 2 through 4. It says this: "The Jews assembled in their cities in all the provinces of King Xerxes to attack those determined to destroy them. No one could stand against them because the people of all the other nationalities were afraid of them. And all the nobles of the provinces, the satraps, the governors, and the king's administrators helped the Jews because fear of Mordecai had seized them. Mordecai was prominent in the palace. His reputation spread throughout the provinces, and he became more and more powerful." Last episode was called The Reversal, and we're seeing more of the aftermath of the reversal in this episode. The Jews, who were once a defenseless minority, now everybody is afraid of them as they're in power. Mordecai, who was once a nobody in the government, who had been overlooked for a promotion, has now been promoted to second in command. He's prominent, he's well known, he's powerful, and now everyone is afraid of getting on his bad side. Formerly, everyone was afraid of getting on Haman's bad side. Now we're afraid of getting on Mordecai's bad side. And it's important to note here that normally when you read through the Old Testament and the people of Israel conquer their enemies, what you see, the effect is normally that they fear the God of Israel as a result of Israel now conquering their enemies. But here, everyone is filled with fear of Mordecai rather than fear of the God of Israel. And so what's happening, I think, is that we're seeing Mordecai begin to become a little bit more like Haman. And it's forcing us to begin to ask one of the questions we have to deal with is, where is God in all of this? Is he even involved at all at this point? Or is this completely stuff that humans, Mordecai and Esther, are up to? Now let's read on. Esther chapter 9, verses 5 through 10. It says this: "The Jews struck down all their enemies with the sword, killing and destroying them. And they did what they pleased to those who hated them. In the citadel of Susa," remember that's the capital city, "the Jews killed and destroyed 500 men. They also killed Parshandatha, Dalphon, Aspatha, Paratha, Adalia, Aridatha, Parsmatha, Arisai, Aridai, and Vasatha." I should have practiced those names. "The 10 sons of Haman, son of Hammedatha, the enemy of the Jews. But they did not lay their hands on the plunder." So again, if this had been a Netflix show, this is the 30-minute battle scene. You know, it's only 5 verses here, or 6 verses, but it would have been filled out with sword fights and gore and beheadings, and it would have been in all the trailers for the show. This would have been part of the highlight reel. And in this scene, what we find is that in the capital city alone, in Susa, 500 men die, as well as Haman's 10 sons. And that detail is included probably to show you that, that they took whatever measures necessary to make sure there was no vengeful coup after all this was over. But one thing that's emphasized is that no one takes any plunder. So nobody takes anybody's homes or wealth or anything else. One commentator writing about this scene says it's essentially a massacre, a Jewish bloodbath against the Persians. And it's hard to say here whether the Jews are taking an offensive or a defensive posture, whether they're attacking people or whether they're simply defending themselves from people who are attacking them. Is this self-defense or is this something else? And honestly, we really don't have a way to answer that question well based on what we have in the text. And then a question about the plunder arises here. Why does Mordecai, he permits them essentially to take plunder, which is their house and wealth and so on, but nobody actually does. It's just death. And this point is actually emphasized 3 times, also in chapter 9, verse 15, and chapter 9, verse 16. And just a pro tip for studying the Bible, if something is mentioned multiple times, usually it's mentioned that way for emphasis and it wants you to pay attention. And so why is this text mentioning multiple times that nobody plundered their enemies? And what's probably happening here is it's forcing us to recall another scene in the Bible. It's forcing us to remember when King Saul, who was the first king of Israel, it's forcing us to remember his first battle against the Amalekites, who were also known as the Agagites, in 1 Samuel 15. And in episode 3 of this series, we talked a little bit about that. But there were 2 major failures in that battle. First is that Saul kept Agag alive, the king of the Amalekites. And we find out later that Haman is also a descendant of Agag, or is at least called an Agagite. So that's the first failure, is he kept Agag alive. The second failure is that instead of destroying everything and keeping no plunder, like God commanded them, what they did instead is they kept some of the best sheep and cattle alive. And there's this famous scene where God says, "What is that bleating of sheep that I hear in the background?" And essentially what had happened is they had taken some of the possessions for themselves with the good intentions of sacrificing them to God, but nonetheless they disobeyed him in taking plunder. But what we see here in this scene is that where Israel had committed those failures under King Saul, those failures are being undone under Esther and Mordecai. And so we're finding out that God's people in exile are actually being more faithful than King Saul was before them. This wasn't about personal gain. Let's read on now in chapter 9, 11 through 15 to see what happens next. It says, "The number of those killed in the citadel of Susa was reported to the king that same day. The king said to Queen Esther, 'The Jews have killed and destroyed 500 men and 10 sons of Haman in the citadel of Susa. What have they done in the rest of the king's provinces? Now what is your petition? It will be given to you. What is your request? It will also be granted.' 'If it pleases the king,' Esther answered, 'give the Jews in Susa permission to carry out this day's edict tomorrow also, and let Haman's 10 sons be impaled on poles.' So the king commanded that this be done. An edict was issued in Susa, and they impaled the 10 sons of Haman. And the Jews in Susa came together on the 14th day of the month of Adar, and they put to death in Susa 300 men, but they did not lay their hands on the plunder." This is where the story takes a dark turn, as Esther actually asked for a second day of killing in the capital city and to impale Haman's 10 sons above the city with their dad. And as a result of her request, 300 more men are killed in Susa on the second day. And there's really no reason given for that. There's no, here's why I'm doing this. There's nothing given. So we're essentially left wondering as readers, why is she asking for this? Why is she asking for more death? It seems like there was already enough. Let's read on and see the results of all of this. Chapter 9, verse 16. It says, "Meanwhile, the remainder of the Jews who were in the king's provinces also assembled to protect themselves and get relief from their enemies. They killed 75,000 of them, but did not lay their hands on the plunder." So including the 800 men killed in the capital city over 2 days, we find out that 75,000 men were killed throughout the whole Persian Empire, making this one of the bloodiest days in the whole of the Old Testament. Let's read on now to the very end of this. It says this, chapter 9, verse 17. "This happened on the 13th day of the month of Adar, and on the 14th day they rested and made it a day of feasting and joy. The Jews in Susa, however, had assembled on the 13th and 14th, and then on the 15th day they rested and made it a day of feasting and joy. That is why rural Jews, those living in villages, observe the 14th of the month as Adar as a day of joy and feasting, a day for giving presents to each other." In these final few verses of this section, we're getting hints of what's called the Feast of Purim. And we're going to talk a lot about that feast and what that looks like even as Christians when it comes to feasts as well next week. But that's just kind of giving us a hint of what's about to come. And that's essentially episode 7, the war. And it's one of the bloodiest scenes in the whole Bible. And the temptation when you're reading this passage is to skip over it or to gloss over the details of it. But I think it's critical that we actually stop here and consider some more. Because I know many unbelievers and skeptics, and even some believers who struggle intensely with scenes like this in the Bible, and for good reason. Episodes like this, they force us as Christians to stop and consider one of the most common critiques I've heard of Christianity. The question, does the Bible approve of and even inspire this kind of violence? Does the Bible approve of and even inspire this kind of violence. One of the most famous versions of this critique was popularized by atheist Christopher Hitchens in his book, God is Not Great. And the subtitle is How Religion Poisons Everything. You can know it's going to be a friendly set of essays. But it's a set of essays that lays out some of the most basic critiques of Christianity and religion in general. And he's a good writer, and so he makes it really accessible for a lot of people. But one of the things he says is basically just look at the history of religion and mark every instance of violence. And you'll see lots of violence, from the battles of Joshua in the Old Testament to the Christian Crusades in the Middle Ages. And you could even include a scene like this from Esther as well. And he goes on to say is that this isn't accidental, that you should actually expect this kind of relationship between religion and violence. You should expect religion to inspire violence like this. Why? He says because religion takes normal individual or even tribal disagreements and it turns them into battles of good versus evil, and with your religion always representing the good guys. And it's not a bad argument. It's a common critique I've heard. And what strengthens this argument is the fact that there's cases throughout history where religion has inspired violence. And there's at least one case of someone using the story of Esther to justify violence against enemies. I was reading through one of the commentaries by Karen Jobes, and she tells the story that happened on February 25th, 1994. A Jewish man named Barrett Goldstein killed 55 Palestinians and wounded 170 at a mosque in Hebron, Israel. And a man who was only hours earlier had been seen in his local synagogue hearing the annual reading of Esther. Now, of course, this is an anomaly, but this is the kind of thing that people will often use. They'll take a story like this one and point, and it will add fuel to the fire of an argument that says religion inspires violence. And so the question is, what do we do with the violence of Esther and the violence of the Old Testament in general? And there are some who would say, well, we just need to get rid of the Old Testament, and we need to stick to the less violent New Testament. And there are some who have attempted to do just that. In fact, there's a name for it. It's called Marcionism. And it's named after a man in the 2nd century named Marcion, who taught that the God of the Old Testament was a completely different God than the one revealed in Jesus. And none of us would claim to be Marcionists today, but it might just sound like us saying something like, well, that's just the God of the Old Testament. But look at Jesus, and let's skip to him. Or that's just the Old Testament. Let's look at the New Testament. Or saying something like, well, we've progressed a lot since then. And that's really what it sounds like today. We try to answer the question of violence by simply glossing over it or getting rid of it. But instead of dismissing this episode entirely, I think it gives us an opportunity to slow down and consider where we're coming from, whether as believers or as unbelievers, when we're critiquing what's happening here, and actually look at our own critiques. And I want to give 2 things for those of you who are struggling with this. The first is this: it's to seek to understand before you're understood. It's kind of a classic. It's like one of Stephen Covey's 7 principles of highly effective people. It's also a good principle of effective Bible reading as well. Even if you disagree with what's going on here, one of the most important things you can do is seek to understand it. Try to put yourself in their shoes for a minute. What would you be feeling if you were a dad or even a mom and of a Jewish family who was in that situation, where you knew that on the 13th day of the month, everybody was going to attack your family? Try to get in their heads for a minute and try to feel what that feels like. Consider the movie Defiance for a moment. There's a movie called Defiance that came out in 2008 starring Daniel Craig, the same guy who plays James Bond. And it tells the story of some Jews in 1941 who escape and take refuge in a forest. It's actually on Netflix. And there's a scene where Daniel Craig's character, his name's Tuvia, shows up at the house of a man who had his parents killed. And they're eating dinner, this family's eating dinner, and he walks in and he barges in and comes out of the rain, and he ends up killing this man and his 2 sons, saying this: "For my parents, for my brothers, and all the others." It's a terribly hard scene to witness. But there's a part of you that even while there's a part of you that wants him to extend mercy to this man and his family, there's another part of you that understands and feels with his longing for justice and the longing to take justice into our own hands. Movies like that help us get a sense of what it might have felt like to be a Jew who had been in a position where the lives of you and your family were threatened. It doesn't mean you have to agree with someone's actions, but it does help you at least make sense of them. So the first is to seek to understand before you're understood. The second thing to do is to critique your own critique. To critique your own critique. Look for holes in your own critique of an episode like this one, in Esther or in the rest of the Bible. Ask yourself, what basis am I using to make this critique? So let's say, for example, someone uses this scene in Esther or another scene like it in the Bible to justify not believing in God, saying something like, I can't possibly believe in a God who would do something like this. But what happens is that actually opens up another question. If I don't believe in God, how can I possibly find anything wrong with what's happening here? Of course, you could say something like, well, people just shouldn't act like that. People should be kind and generous and altruistic and nonviolent. But the reality is that without God, life really is just survival of the fittest, either at an individual level or at a collective or national level. Even if we believe that humans should act differently, we really have no basis that says that they should. And in the end, it's survival of the fittest. And so if we say, I can't believe in a God who would permit something like that, the reality is it opens up the question of, well, if I don't, how can I even critique this in the first place? So of course, doing these two things, both seeking to understand before you're understood and critiquing your own critique, doesn't solve the dilemma. But it does destabilize it just enough to consider how to make sense of what's going on here. And so I want to just consider now a little bit about what's going on here. On the one hand, you have to consider the fact that God isn't mentioned in this scene. That doesn't mean that God isn't here and he's not present, but this is one of those moments in Esther where you're kind of glad God isn't mentioned. Because it doesn't mean that you have to attribute this directly to God. While it's possible that Esther and Mordecai are actually ordering this on their own, maybe without God's explicit approval. We don't know. But we do know that God, no matter what, God providentially used this scene in his story of redemption. But in the end, God isn't mentioned here. The reality is, on the other hand, you have to consider the fact that God is mentioned in the other episodes of biblical violence, especially in the book of Joshua. And I don't have time to deal with each of those right now, but I want to bring it back to something we talked about last week. The whole Bible, we talked about this last week, the whole Bible from beginning to end is one big story. And it's one long story of redemption, of God rescuing humanity from the snare of sin and death. And as part of that story, God chose one family from all the families of the earth, the family of Abraham. And through them, he brought about the people called the Jews. And he made promises to them, saying that through you, I'm going to bring salvation and blessing and knowledge of God for all nations. And through them, eventually one would be born, a Jew would be born named Jesus Christ. And if God's people cease to exist, which is a very real possibility in the ancient world, or in the very violent ancient world, it would have been the end of his plan of redemption for everyone. So here's what Karen Jobes, the commentator I've been using, writes. She says, therefore, the success of God's plan of redemption requires the protection of his people in his war against evil, which require that those people take both an offensive and a defensive measures to assure their existence. In other words, God had to do things to make sure that these people continued to exist. That's part of what the whole book of Esther is all about. And so I want to give a quick illustration from Harry Potter. For those of you who are currently reading it, are watching Harry Potter for the first time, or still think it's really evil and you shouldn't read it at all, or you aren't finished with it yet, just close your ears and skip ahead. Ignore this for a minute because I'm going to give away some stuff. But for those of you who have read it, or those of you who never plan to, let me give you just a quick illustration from that story. So Harry Potter is basically the chosen one. He's the Messiah character. He's the character who will ultimately defeat Voldemort, who's the villain in the story, who wants to control the whole wizarding world. And J.K. Rowling, the author, takes 7 books, there's 7 books in the series, to tell this story of Harry Potter, the chosen one, coming to defeat Voldemort. And for most of those 7 books, there's a character named Professor Severus Snape, and he just sounds like an evil character. And he does things that are hard to understand. And at one point, he just appears straight up like he's on the side of evil. At the end of book 6, he actually kills Professor Dumbledore, and he looks like he's on the side of Voldemort and the Death Eaters. And Professor Dumbledore was the headmaster. He's like one of the best characters in the book. And if you stopped reading the series right there at the end of book 6, you would actually think Snape was evil. But when you read through the end of book 7, you find out that Snape was actually committed to only one thing. He was extremely loyal to Dumbledore, and he was committed to protecting Harry Potter, the chosen one, the one who would save the world at all costs. And Dumbledore actually told him that might require Snape to kill him in the end. And so what you see when you're only reading at the end of book 6, you have no idea until you see the whole story of redemption at the end. So only after you've read all 7 books are you able to make sense of Snape's action in the first 6. And I think the same is true of the scriptures, that we need all 66 to make sense of what's happening in the first 39. We need all the books to make sense of God's story of redemption. Now, that by no means completely answers the dilemma, but that's a start. For more, I'd suggest reading a book by Rebecca McLaughlin called Confronting Christianity, or a book by Tim Keller called The Reason for God. In that, they deal with a lot of the basic critiques of Christianity, and both have chapters on religion and violence. But here's the thing. Even if we were able to make sense of the violence in this story, and even the violence of the rest of the Bible, it's hard to make sense of what Esther does in this episode when she requests a second day of killing in the capital city of Susa. When I was reading the story of Esther in preparation for this series, and I was noticing things that maybe I'd never noticed before, the moment that messed me up the most was the moment in chapter 9, verse 13, where Esther asked for a second day of killing, where she says, "If it pleases the king, give the Jews in Susa permission to carry out this day's edict tomorrow also." And as a result, 300 more people are killed in the capital city of Susa. The commentator I've been reading says, nobody's saying, you go, Esther, like, great job, like, that's exactly the right thing to do. Again, that after scouring every commentary on Esther from both Jews and Christians, Karen Jobes, who's the commentator I've been reading, she says this: the biblical Esther is evaluated almost universally in negative terms for requesting a second day of killing. The author of the book of Esther makes no attempt to exonerate the queen or to justify her request. In other words, there's no practical reason why she makes this request for a second day, beyond maybe spite and vengeance. In fact, in many ways, just like we saw with Mordecai, we're seeing Esther become like Haman, the most hated person in this whole story. If you remember from episode 5, when we looked at Haman's downfall, we said sometimes the only difference between us and Haman is the degree of power that we have. It's easy to say, oh man, I would never be like Haman. But the more you read this story, the more you say, you know what, I'm a little bit like him. And I can see myself in him. The only thing missing maybe is the degree of power. And now that Esther and Mordecai are in control, it seems that they're capable of some of the same atrocities. And Jobes goes on to say, she says, the Bible is remarkable in revealing the darker side of God's chosen leaders. The Bible is remarkable in revealing the darker side of God's chosen leaders. Instead of hiding over or glossing over inconsistencies and flaws, the Bible often shows stark candor and revealing the inconsistencies and the flaws of its most important characters. Consider David, right? He's the most famous king in all of Israel, but the Bible is blunt about the fact that he had a #MeToo level affair with a married woman named Bathsheba and had her husband killed at the front lines of war as a result. Or consider Peter. He's one of the most famous apostles of Jesus, but the gospel stories include the scene where he denies even knowing Jesus 3 times. And in one of Paul's letter to the Galatians, he actually calls out Peter for his inconsistent religiosity and refusing to hang out with non-Jews. And there's more. Just read the story of Noah, or Abraham, or Jacob, or Isaac, or Sarah, or Solomon, or Gideon, or anyone else, and you'll find the same moments where the Bible reveals their dark and embarrassing side. And if anything, the inclusion of these embarrassing details adds credibility to the stories of the Bible. If the writers were just making up these stories, why would they include these kinds of details that make their heroes look more like villains? You would just edit those out, but they're included anyways. But not only does this add credibility to the story of Esther and to the Bible in general, I think it's also closer to what we experience as ordinary people in everyday life. In a culture longing for authenticity, we have a Bible that includes characters who have made the same mistakes that we have, maybe at a grander level in some cases. But here's how we could say it. Instead of hiding messy people, the Bible makes room for messy people like us. Instead of hiding messy people, the Bible makes room for messy and sinful people like us. People like Esther who get it right sometimes and who get it really wrong sometimes too. Like Esther, we can be quick to take vengeance into our own hands. Think about your own life. Have you ever had a moment where you wanted to get back at someone for what they did to you, wanting not just to get even, but maybe even to take it to the next level? Maybe it was someone at work who insulted you or said something about you to your boss that made him or her overlook you for a promotion, and everything in you is looking for a moment to get back at them. Maybe it was with someone you were in a relationship with. They did something to you and it wasn't enough to just break up. You want to make them feel what you felt. Or Or maybe it was a family member, a parent or a grown child or a sibling, and they hurt you, and you found yourself fantasizing about ways to get back at them, even if you know the one thing that would hurt them most would simply be giving them the cold shoulder and not responding to their calls or emails or text messages. Or consider what happens at a collective level, like what we see in this story. Esther wasn't just retaliating for personal insult. She was retaliating for a collective insult and harm against the Jews. And when a marginalized group can find themselves sometimes in a position of power, the first thing that sometimes people do is leverage that newfound power to get revenge, especially politically. I had to cut out all the examples of that just because we don't have time. And so even if we're not asking for a second day of killing, most of us have been in positions where we've sought revenge or at least fantasized about revenge against someone to get back at them for what they did or tried to do to us. And so when it comes to seeking revenge, we're no better than Esther. But there's someone who is. Let's skip ahead a couple of centuries. When God entered into the story in the person of Jesus Christ, he had the right to show up with revenge for his enemies, those like us who had resisted him and sinned against him. Yet here's what happened instead. Instead of coming with revenge in his heart, Jesus came with reconciliation in his hands. Instead of coming with revenge in his heart, Jesus came with reconciliation in his hands. That's the gospel, the good news of what God has done for us. Romans chapter 5, verse 10 says this, "While we were still God's enemies, we were reconciled to him through the death of his son." Notice it says, not when we got our lives together, not because we were good by nature, not because we were good enough. It says, while we were still God's enemies. Just as Esther had enemies all throughout the Persian Empire, we were God's enemies. But where Esther sought revenge, God sought reconciliation. Instead of making us pay, he absorbed the cost himself. He didn't just say, let's pretend like nothing ever happened, like we talked about last week. He took what we deserved for our sins on himself. Like Haman's 10 sons, we deserve to be impaled above the city, but God chose to take that punishment on himself. When you look at the cross, what you're seeing is what we deserved. Instead of coming with revenge in his heart, Jesus came with reconciliation in his hands. And this completely changes how we think about revenge. First, we know that we can do for others what God has done for us. We don't have to seek revenge anymore, and we don't even have to get even. We're free to follow the commands of Jesus, to turn the other cheek, to walk the extra mile, just as he did. We live in a kingdom where it's safe to do that. And second, we can trust that Jesus will one day wipe out evil. This doesn't mean that we don't do anything about evil and injustices we see in the world, but we know that God, who is the righteous judge, will one day return and wipe out all evil, which frees us from violence and our longing for justice. Tim Keller, in his book, The Reason for God, paraphrases theologian Miroslav Volf, who is a Croatian who saw firsthand violence in his life. And he writes, "Only if I am sure that there's a God who will right all wrongs and settle all accounts perfectly, do I have the power to refrain." Let me read that again. "Only if I am sure that there's a God who will right all wrongs and settle all accounts perfectly, do I have the power to refrain." Only because we know that one day God will wipe out evil do we have the power to now refrain in getting violent revenge on other people. While this episode taken alone might inspire violence, this episode situated within the whole story of the Bible actually makes us less violent, because we have a God who, instead of seeking revenge against his enemies like Esther did, sought reconciliation and made us his partners in reconciliation in the world. As we head into communion, which you can follow along in your at-home worship guide, we get a glimpse of how Jesus disrupted the cycle of violence and vengeance in the world. As we eat bread, which represents his body broken for us, and drink juice, which represents his blood poured out for us, we remember that Jesus gave his life to reconcile us to God instead of getting revenge on us. That Jesus absorbed the cost himself. It's here at this table every week where you can take every feeling of revenge that you have and lay it at the feet of Jesus, remembering that Jesus did not take revenge on us, but rather laid down his life for imperfect people like Esther and imperfect people like us. At this point, I encourage you to finish out this service on your own, taking communion, spending a few minutes in prayer, or even requesting prayer and giving to our church if you haven't already. And we'll see you again next week.